Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at this webinar organized by Chennai International Center. We'll begin the webinar shortly with a welcome address by Venu Gopal Kasturi, Trustee CIC. Over to you, Venu.
Thank you, Vanita. Good evening and welcome all to Chennai International Center and to an important and topical discussion on what the upcoming US presidential elections mean for India. These elections happen once every 4 years, and outcomes have always influenced the shape of US relations with India. Nothing extraordinary, you may say, yet this time it is different in many ways. India and the US are now aligned as rarely before. In economics, the US is India's largest trading partner, having dislodged China a year ago. In geopolitics, in sharp contrast to what prevailed some decades ago when the US decidedly weighed in on Pakistan's side, the US is now more India's ally on many international issues. And now there is alignment even as victims of the COVID pandemic. The US is world's #1 and India world's #2 as far as cases go. Of course, that's a podium nobody wants to be on. These elections mean a lot specifically to a corner of India, to a corner of our own city of Chennai, to be precise, to Besant Nagar here, where live the family of Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. For surely the first time in history, resident Indians are directly invested in these elections, or so they think. Chennai and its heart will be directly touched by the outcome. To analyze the import of the elections, we have with us a highly respected panel from various parts of the world. In Bengaluru, we have Ambassador Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary to the Government of India and former Ambassador to the United States and China. During her 4-decade-long diplomatic career, she's been a woman of several firsts. The first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi. The first woman High Commissioner from India to Sri Lanka, and the first woman ambassador to China. On her retirement from active diplomatic service, Ambassador Rao has entered the world of academics and continues to pursue a passion in music. In Singapore, we have Professor Raja Mohan, a top Indian academic and currently Director, Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. He was for some time the Strategic Affairs Editor of The Hindu and has been associated with several think tanks in New Delhi, including the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. From the West Coast in Silicon Valley, we have M.R. Rangaswamy, an entrepreneur, investor, corporate strategy expert, community builder, and philanthropist. He's the co-founder of Sandhill Group, one of the earliest angel investment firms, and was named to the Forbes Midas list of investors. MR is also the founder of Diaspora, a non-profit organization that unites the Indian diaspora in the US to transform their success into meaningful impact in India and on the global stage. Diaspora recently released a report on the Indian American voter survey, and sure, it'll be a timely feed for today's discussion. In Washington, D.C., to moderate today's discussion, we have Sriram Lakshman, US correspondent for the Hindu newspaper group. He has a career in economic consulting and has covered the French elections of 2017. He now covers politics in Washington, India's US relations, and the United Nations. Over to Sriram. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Venu. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning to you. Thank you all for joining us today. And panelists, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Dr. Raja Mohan, and Mr. M.R. Rangaswamy, I welcome you today to this panel and thank you for your participation. We are less than 50 days away from the US elections, and the outcome of November 3rd, or the weeks surrounding it, or that entire month, in fact, will have far-reaching implications for not just the US, but the rest of the world, and specifically for India. The policy decisions made by the next president of the United States on security, trade, immigration, science, and public health cooperation, the extent of their administration's support for global institutions, their views on India and its neighbors, the bets the next administration will make on the future of the US relationship with India, as well as countries in the Asian neighborhood, will have significant implications for India and how it does business in the larger world. US government policy and the direction set by the president has deep implications for literally hundreds of thousands of Indians there in India or here in the US, as well as Indian Americans. We have a very clear example of this impact from recent times, when the US president's executive orders on immigration impacted the day-to-day lives and the futures of students, workers, and their families. The people-to-people ties between India and the US are often talked about as being an important force in progressing the relationship. With some 4.1 to 4.5 million Indian Americans, plus another million or so Indian citizens in the US, understanding this group, which, like India, is itself diverse, is an important part of understanding the relationship between India and the US. Venu has touched upon both these larger aspects of the interaction between India and the US, as well as the more people-to-people level impacts, including the vice presidential nomination on the Democratic side. And we'll get to a few of these topics today. So for today's panel, we're going to address two major themes. One, we're going to look at the diaspora and examine its relationship with American politics. And two, we're going to examine the foreign policy implications of the US election, situating it in the context of the US's own domestic politics, of course. We'll first have opening remarks from each of our three panelists, following which I will ask a couple of rounds of questions, and then we'll open up the session to questions from the audience. With that, I'd like to invite Mr. Rangaswamy to deliver his opening remarks. MR?
Thank you so much, Sriram, and thank you to CIC for having me at your great event today. Again, quickly, Diaspora is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works on three major issues. One is around political engagement. The second one is around community issues. And finally, a lot of work is being done by us on philanthropy. We are a membership group of influential diaspora and Indian leaders as well. And we have a platform that helps us amplify the voices of our community. We were started in 2012, and that's the time that Diaspora's members asked a very meaningful question, which is, if we're 1% of the US population, how come we have no representation in the US Congress? And so this was the goal that the whole community had. And Diaspora itself cannot endorse or give money to candidates, but our entire network gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to anybody with an Indian name, whether it's Krishnamurthy or Jayapal or Khanna. And within 3 election cycles, in 2017, the Indian Americans were 1% of Congress. And Diaspora had a big gala in DC where even Speaker Pelosi and many other leaders came to felicitate this group of people, but also to show that they were leading Indian Americans even on the administration side. So the thing about our community is we are both on the Republican and Democratic side in very large numbers. Diaspora is also held in Diaspora Ball for president. Again, part of our objective here is to show the support and influence that we have as a community in the US. Now, Indian Americans and India has been a lot in the spotlight this year in spite of COVID. Of course, we had President Trump visit India in February, one of the last trips he took before COVID set in. And Kamala Harris was nominated as a Democratic vice presidential candidate. Indian Americans now are being heavily courted by Democrats and Republicans. I think in our survey that we released, we said 56% of the respondents said they'd been contacted by the Democratic Party. And let's see here, 46% said that the Republicans had contacted them. Again, you might ask, why is such a small community of 4 million people with about 1.8 million registered voters so important to both parties? I think there are 3 reasons why. Indian Americans have started contributing money in big numbers over the last several years. In fact, in the presidential primary on the Democratic side, several $1 million were given to candidates. And in this general election, again, millions of dollars have been given and raised by the Indian community. In fact, 25% of the survey respondents said they had actually given money to a political party. The second thing is, Diaspora has helped inspire hundreds of people to run for public office. We have this election cycle, we cannot even count the number. There's several hundred Indian Americans running for local, city, state, and federal offices. These are huge numbers of people. In fact, some cities in California, you'll see posters and signs with dozens of Indian names for councilmen, mayor, and so on and so forth. And finally, Indian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic minority. And in fact, it's projected in a few years, our community will be larger than the Chinese community. And how is this happening? First of all, we have citizens. The second thing is that there's a backlog of, I think, about 500,000 Indians who are green card holders who have applied for citizenship, and they're being processed. And then behind that, there's a backlog of several 100,000 Indians waiting for their green cards. So if you project out over the next 10 years, there'll literally be 100,000 Indian citizens in the US each and every year. So this is not only becoming a community that is fast growing, but many of these Indians are residing in what's so-called battleground states. There are Indians now in Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, even Texas, where they could swing the election one way or the other. So again, this has really brought a spotlight to our community. And we just did the survey recently of 260 voters. I'll just quickly share 2 or 3 highlights before I turn it over to our next panelist. First of all, 66% of the community currently favors Vice President Biden, 28% is for President Trump, and 6% is undecided. In the 2016 election, it ended up with 77% being for Hillary Clinton and 16% for Trump. So if the undecided voters this year break in the same pattern as they do with the general, then Biden would secure 70% of the Indian American vote compared to 30% for Trump. This is indeed an increase for Trump over the last election, and we can discuss later why. Second, 54% of Indian Americans identified as Democrats, only 16% as Republicans, and 24% as independents. So we can see that the share of people being independents and Democrats rising, the share of Republicans is decreasing. The important issues to our community is not just whether Kamala Harris is of Indian descent or if Trump and Modi are friends. It's much more than that. Indian Americans are very interested in education, the jobs and economy, healthcare, and the environment. They're also very active in racial, actions against racial discrimination, police reforms, national security, and immigration as well. US foreign policy in Asia is much lower at 66%, and we can also talk about that as well. So in closing, I want to just tell you that our website is indiaspora.org, indiaspora.org, and you can keep in touch with subscribing our weekly newsletter on our website. Again, as I jokingly say before I turn it over, finally, Americans are actually able to pronounce Indian names, whether it's Sri Ram or Nirupama or Raja Mohan or any of these names. So we're very happy that everybody in the US is learning how to actually pronounce Indian names. So with that, Sri Ram, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Amar, for that discussion, for those comments and those very interesting numbers. Ambassador Rao, would you like to set the scene for us in the foreign policy context?
Thank you, Sriram, and thank you to the Chennai International Center for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel this evening. We've just heard MR speak about the Indian diaspora, the Indian American community in the United States, and their increasingly important and substantive profile in American national life. Now, I'm going to speak a little about the impact of the US elections as I see it from the point of view of a foreign policy practitioner. Now, the view from here, I'm talking from Bangalore. Every 4 years, we focus our attention on the United States, which we see as a fountainhead of democracy across the world. And we wish to assess the developments that surround the process that informs the presidential election and which culminates in the choice made by the American people of the candidate who will be their leader and who comes to occupy, and about that most are agreed, the most powerful office in the world. Now this year, 2020, the situation is particularly unique because the entire world, including the United States, there are no borders here, we're all battling a threat that we were essentially unprepared for, a global pandemic unleashed by a virus that we know as COVID-19. The pandemic has united us in a common struggle and reminds us, as I said, how borderless our planet is, and it brings us closer together. And from that point of view also, the outcome of the US presidential election seems to me to possess a sense of immediacy that we perhaps did not sense in previous years. Now, coming to the way the United States is viewed in India, the US is a country that is viewed essentially very favorably by a large proportion of the educated middle-class population in this country. And secondly, the relationship between India and the United States is, I believe, the most important foreign policy relationship that we have today. And there's another reason why we in India, as citizens of the world's largest democracy, feel invested in the presidential election in the US. Firstly, of course, the fact that we are sister democracies that share so many common values with Americans, our constitutional values, our fundamental freedoms, our plurality, our diversity, our openness. Secondly, of course, there is the comprehensive strategic global partnership between our two countries. That's the way we refer to it. That's the phraseology we use, which is today being played out against the backdrop of the Indo-Pacific, the region that in a way stretches from the coast of California to the east coast of Africa, and of course includes India as a very central part of it. Now, this comprehensive partnership is further bolstered, and this is the third factor, by the organic linkages provided by the Indian diaspora in the United States. Fourthly, there is this three-body problem, to use a phrase from astrophysics, that informs the US-India relationship. China is very much a part of it. So the rise of China, the challenge of China, forms a part of what Professor Bhagwati of Columbia University recently called this three-body problem. Then there is, on the part of India and the United States, our common commitment to a rule-based international order. Everything that we feel today, China is antithetical to. Now, this comprehensive global partnership, the strategic partnership, has nurtured a relationship in this century that spans almost every field of human endeavor, whether it's defense, counterterrorism, trade, investment, energy, the environment, healthcare, agriculture, science and technology, education, space, the oceans, and much more, as Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said recently. To recall his words, and I quote, "The United States and India see each other as great pluralist democracies, global powers, and good friends," unquote. So this is a natural partnership, You've heard the phrase natural allies, natural partners, and we don't share an alliance relationship, but the term allies is used perhaps somewhat loosely, but in many ways I think has come to symbolize the consonance, the convergence of our interests. And it's flourished across political divides in both our countries. It's a unison of democratic forces, regardless of political affiliation, and our interests are mutually reinforcing and sustaining. And a succession of administrations, and this is where the outcome of the elections really comes into, a succession of administrations in the US and in governments of India, successive governments of India, have each contributed to the strengthening of bilateral understandings since the early 2000s. Gone are the days when we were estranged democracies, which was the phrase we used in the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s. The American political parties, whether Republican or Democrat, have both been sincere champions of this relationship. And our leaders and American leaders have forged deep and abiding ties of friendship and mutual trust and confidence. One is only to hearken back to the Howdy Modi event in Houston last October, and of course the Namaste Trump, really this bash that we saw in Ahmedabad this February when President Trump came. So there is this popular imagination that is all fired up about this relationship, and these are obviously valuable and precious assets. So this is something that imbues us with the belief that regardless of who is the winner of the presidential election this November, the US-India relationship will continue to remain in good and safe hands, and it will evolve and grow from strength to strength because our areas of agreement will far outdistance and outweigh any small trifling differences that we have. All friends are these, but they deal with them with mature resolve and balanced judgment. So this is a relationship whose future inspires us with hope. I don't want to talk too long, but I just wanted to also flag something that some American friends pointed out to me just 2 days ago in a webinar that I attended. Now, Mr. Biden has, of course, been leading in the polls for months now. But last time, as you know, the way the elections work, it was Mr. Trump who won the Electoral College despite Ms. Clinton having won the popular vote. Mr. Biden leads in every battleground state, but there is this final 2-month sprint ahead in the polls. And we'll have to see. It's going to be quite a nail-biting finish. At the moment, Mr. Biden may enjoy a fairly significant advantage politically. He's better positioned than perhaps Mrs. Clinton was at this time. He presents a more formidable threat to Trump. But there are 3 or 4 things that Mr. Trump has going for him. There are very few figures, I think, on the national or international stage quite like Donald Trump. And he's a real television phenomenon, as you know, a larger-than-life figure. You either love him or hate him. There are very few like him. And in many ways, this election is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. And this is a man who plays to win. He's highly tenacious, highly energetic for a 75-year-old, and he hates to lose. He wants to get across the finish line first. And while he does not have massive popular support, he has a very energized political base, a highly motivated group of voters who are quite blindly supportive of him. And he has a certain advantage of a very complicated electoral college system, support from smaller states, support from the rural areas, appeals to lower income white voters in the South and the Midwest. In short, he has populist appeal. So I think we'll have to watch this process in the next few weeks very closely. And I think Mr. Trump is capitalizing, I think, a little on the law and order issue, even if the pandemic has hurt him. Issues of racial justice may have hurt him. That spawned protests and demonstrations and violence. And this, in a sense, has triggered a greater degree of support among middle-class voters who were originally not very supportive of Mr. Trump. But as the protests have increased, there is growing concern in middle-class circles about violence, and Mr. Trump is playing on this. So, and then also importantly, we'll have to see how the debates go, the presidential debates. They will start very shortly. There are 3 presidential ones and one vice presidential one. And the first debate is going to be extremely critical because most Americans will see Biden and Trump together for the first time. And in fact, the first 30 minutes of that first debate is going to be very critical. And then, of course, you have the outcome, vote counting, announcing results. Most Democrats vote by mail. There may be real controversies and protests. And we'll have to see how the situation unfolds. So I'd like to stop here and just end by saying India is in a very unusual position because it's a bipartisan favorite in Washington. China is being looked at in a very skeptical way and seen as a strategic challenge both in the US and in India. And while the Trump administration has been good for this relationship, I have no doubt that even a Biden administration will be very good for this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those excellent and comprehensive remarks covering both setting the scene domestically in the US as well as looking at the relationship over the course of time between India and the United States. Dr. Raja Mohan?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sriram. Thanks to the Chennai International Center for inviting me to be part of this very timely and very interesting panel. So much has already been said, so I'm just going to make three sets of points. The first is the importance of understanding the US domestic dynamics, that most countries tend to relate to the US through a narrow prism of bilateral relations. But those bilateral relations are actually influenced by changes in the United States, so therefore we need to pay more attention to US domestic politics. And at this point, it's even more important that we pay attention to American domestic politics because the US is so divided, so deeply polarized, and so contentious with itself. So I think it's quite a unique moment in the United States. We've seen a horrendous summer, the pandemic, the urban riots, and the challenge to the holiest icons of American history statues are being pulled down. We've seen it happen in the last few weeks. And I think this polarization, accelerated. Certainly I'm not even talking about the Democratic Party, but much of the mainstream elite was not reconciled to Trump's election. You could argue with that, but the fact of someone who did not belong. And I think that set the stage for a series of actions, including impeachment in the last few years, and an unprecedented hatred that has come into the campaign. You could partly blame Trump's post, but the fact is, as outsiders, we don't have a vote in the US election, unlike MR, that we go by what we see and we have to analyze what is going on in that country. Going to end. The process of election itself is contested. You might think you are in some kind of a third world democracy. The counting procedures, because US has an interesting system, federal, it could vary, rules could vary from place to place, but this time the controversy of it's going to be one.
Sorry, Dr. Rajamohan, we lost you there for a second. Could you reiterate?
Okay, sorry. No, I was saying the process of election itself is being contested this time in the US. The mail-in vote, that 50% of plus Democrats are going to vote by postal ballots. When they will be counted, how they will be counted, it's already become a major legal issue. And it's likely that on November 3rd, we will not have an victor. And how long this counting will take place and how that will come is not clear. Both sides are already accusing the other of about stealing the election. So the stage is being set for a deep contention on November 3rd. And when the Electoral College meets on December 14th, and if the result is quite tight, there are going to be defections probably in the Electoral College. And so we're going to be this is going to be a messy, messy election. And I think the rest of the world must be prepared for it. The second theme I wanted to talk about was really the Trump disruption. Trump has challenged three core premises of US America One is the merits of an open economy and globalization.
Sorry, Dr. Rajamohan, I think your sound kept cutting out again. Maybe if you want to switch off your video, we could get the audio.
Okay, I'll do that, yeah. Maybe this will be better. When I was saying the three aspects that Trump has fundamental. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's cutting in and out, but we can hear you.
I'm sorry, I thought, or at least it's generally good. Let me, when I think that Trump is challenging policy, and that's had consequences for WTO, for policies with Germany and China. So the fundamental questioning of globalization, the argument that globalization has worked for American people, is a central argument since he continues, and I think that issue is going to be thought. Second, that was a good, that the US is welcoming to outsiders, to anyone, whether there's relations of the people already in or refugee workers are coming in. And I think debate in a serious turn, and I think this will have consequences for us on our which Amar talked about, is to grow. And the third issue, the question of American leadership of the international system. Trump has challenged the alliances, questioned the American role in he's questioned the use of endless wars by internationalists. And essentially, his framework of America First trashes the structure, walked away from the treaties and international institutions, including the WHO, and a range of multilateral institutions. He thinks they constrain American unity. Sounds almost like Indians. I mean, we were the ones who unity. Today, no leader talks unity as much as Trump does. So, how do these three things affect us? I would say, on issue, the trade issue had problems with Trump, and I suspect those problems are going to continue even if Biden comes, because Biden himself moved to the left. So I think on trade, where it has been not an easy part, although increase, the distance to increase whichever the next president is. Second, I think on H-1B visas, on immigration, has been more supportive.
Dr. Rajamohan, I think your network is a bit unstable. Sriram, would you like to go to the other panelists and then come back to Dr. Rajamohan, please? We can't hear you, Sriram.
Sure, we'll do that. We will start with some questions and then get back to Dr. Rajamohan and pick up where he left off. Amar, I'd like to start with you. Ambassador Rao had mentioned how this is going to be a referendum on Trump. She had also talked about, Trump has support in an electoral college advantage in some of those key states. And you had also brought up the battleground states. And, during the course of my reporting, I've noticed that both the Democrats and the Republicans are making a play for literally tens of thousands of Indians in battleground states, because the number of Indian Americans there exceeds the margin, the vote, the margin of winning of a candidate in that state. So this is a very key demographic, could be a very key demographic. In the Indian press, when you're seeing it from here in the US, there's a big deal made out of the Trump Modi Bonhomie, for example, the events in Houston, the event in Ahmedabad. There's also a big deal made out of the Kamala Harris factor, the Indian American factor. So these factors work on both sides. And my question to you is, we have data from you that says that foreign policy towards Asia ranks relatively low compared to, say, healthcare, immigration, racial justice issues, and so forth. How do you assess on the Democratic side, the Indian American factor, Kamala Harris, and on the Republican side, the Trump-Modi Bonhomie, in the light of the numbers that you've received?
Definitely, Sriram, the excitement for the community is the Trump-Modi partnership and Kamala Harris being Indian. No doubt about it. Those are kind of the emotional X factors on both sides. But when we surveyed the Indian American voters, we looked at 10 different issues because, the question here is to say, do you just go for this one issue, which is Trump and Modi are friends, I'll vote for Trump, or Kamala Harris is Indian, I'll vote for Kamala. We want to educate the voters to really look at all the issues for them. And that's why the survey included immigration and education and foreign policy and so forth. So really, it's a chance for us to enlighten the voters to look across the board, because after all, we're all US citizens and we live in this country. So it's not just, electing one person or another. What are issues important to us, right? So I think that's the question that we are educating people on. I think the second thing, Sriram, you said was on the battleground states. Just to give you some numbers, in Florida, there are 87,000 Indian votes. In Pennsylvania, 61,000 votes. In Georgia, 57,000 votes. In North Carolina, 36,000 votes. Michigan, 45,000. And Texas, 161,000. So even though our community is small, in all these states, we're playing a disproportionately high share of one way or the other. If these voters stay at home, something can happen. If they come out and vote per what they're saying they would, it would be a different outcome. So clearly, in many of these states, Indian American votes can decide the Electoral College. So our role is to really educate them on all the issues and for them to make up their mind one way or the other.
Thanks, Mark. Ambassador Rao, in your opening remarks, you said that the November 3rd or the November elections are unique and that they possess a sense of immediacy because of the crisis that we're all in together now. Obviously, and where both India and the US have not done too well in terms of the caseload with COVID, but in terms of the relationship between them and cooperation, say whether it's organizing bubble flights or whether it's sending paracetamol, even though that happened after a nudge, it's not, at least in my view, it's not unreasonable to say there has been coordination and cooperation between the two countries, no matter what's happening domestically with COVID, internationally between India and the US. How do you see this playing out if Trump gets a second term or if Biden is the next president? The sense of immediacy, what are the factors in that space? How is the COVID question going to be addressed, both if Trump is back again for another 4 years, or what can change if Biden is there?
Thank you, Sriram. Well, if Mr. Trump is re-elected and this is his second term, I suppose you will see more of what we've seen in the last 4 years. That goes without saying. I think his focus will be very, very emphatically in a future 4-year term on China. And that has implications for us also, given the situation that we face along the line of actual control, as you know, in Ladakh with China today, and what the US support for us in that context can be. We during the Trump years, you saw a further progression in this relationship. Some would argue, essentially, in the security and defense spheres, given the differences that we've had on trade, given the dissonances that have been expressed by the Trump administration when it comes to multilateral institutions, particularly cooperation on dealing with the pandemic through the WHO, where I don't think India and the United States are exactly on the same page, as it were. So we'll have to see how that plays out if there is a future Trump administration re-elected as a result of the elections in November. But by and large, I believe that the tempo and the tenor of this relationship will be maintained in a future Trump administration. And if it comes to a Biden administration, I don't believe it will just be a replay of what we saw in the Obama-Biden years. I believe today the focus on Middle America is important for both candidates. So questions of trade, even if Biden says he's not going to be transactional, the whole question of what's good for America and what's good for the average American, especially the American in the small town or the American in the rural areas, is going to be equally important for Biden as it is for Trump, even if he expresses it in a less stentorian fashion, as it were. So by and large, I think the sense of immediacy comes from the fact that this relationship, the US-India relationship, has become so crucial, not only for India's foreign policy outlook when it comes to the region and when it comes to the world, but also because there is so much invested in this relationship today. The kind of the pillars of this relationship that have grown stronger and much more visible in successive administrations will be those pillars on which I'm sure India is looking to for greater and greater support. India is certainly going to move and gravitate much more closely to the United States and its partners, given the situation that we face vis-a-vis China, and essentially when it comes to how we manage this whole Indo-Pacific vision of ours, whether it's how the Quad defines itself, the way its policy is going to be played out, how we are going to use and leverage these partnerships to create a greater external balancing equilibrium for us when it comes to the threats we face.
Thanks, Ambassador. I want to get back to you in a bit on some very interesting points you raised there about the Quad and inevitability now going closer to the US. I want to circle back to Dr. Raja Mohan, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to finish your thoughts. But I also have a question. We were with you when you were still talking about Trump as a disruptor. A disruptor can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you sit. How would you grade Trump, the disruptor, in terms of what he's done for India? On the one hand, it can be argued that he's created this space, perhaps unwittingly, for plurilateralism and for smaller multilateral organizations, some space for India to be a larger actor in the world. And of course, there's also been disruptive in terms of the WTO, WHO, and other forums that India wants to back. How can you help us think through this issue and how Trump is for India as a disruptor?
So whether it's good or bad, I apologize for the earlier problem. Whether it is good or bad is really secondary to me, because that's being decided by US domestic politics. We have to deal with, given the scale and weight of the US, we have to deal with it. So I'll take two disruptions. I think one on the question of trade, contesting WTO, contesting the nature of the international liberalization that has been the kind of mantra for the last 30 years. He's put his partners in trouble. And I think Biden has already moved to the left. And as you know, domestically, it is a contestation for the working class, which is seen as losing from globalization. Therefore, those votes in the Midwest have become important. So both parties are going to play for this. So whoever comes to power, I think the Biden people, the Democrats became more liberal on trade. Today will move back to the left, which is what Bernie Sanders' impact continues. So therefore, we're going to have the nitpicking on trade issues, and trade-related disputes are going to get intensified. Second, I think Trump said, look, human rights are not very important for me. What matters for me is trade and other issues. So that has worked reasonably well for India, I think, in the sense that it is no longer focusing on the kind of issues Democrats. The emphasis on human rights, was Article 370 modification good or bad? Those kind of issues, which a section of the Democrats, I won't say large, have raised those issues. The New York Times, liberal press, continues to raise it. So the liberals and the Democratic Party are contesting some of India's domestic positions, which Trump did not. So we have to deal with that. Third, on the Trump's policy of retrenchment from the Middle Eastern wars. So the retrenchment from Afghanistan is bad for us, since we love to have the Americans fight till the last American. But the fact is, it's not going to happen. But so we have to deal with the new situation. Americans are not going to be around. But on India-Pakistan issues, where there was stronger support from Trump than the previous administration on terrorism, on preventing China from pushing the Kashmir question in the UN Security Council, and on supporting India on the Pulwama and the Balakot issues. So that has worked nicely for India. But a liberal Biden coming back, might have fresh problems on a different set of issues of India-Pakistan. And finally, while on the China issue too, I think there is much greater convergence. But if Biden comes, I suspect if Biden says, look, engagement of China on climate change is more important than having a new Cold War with China. These are words not mine. These are from the manifesto of the Democratic Party. They say engagement of China is important. We don't want a new Cold War. If that is true, then the priority might look like Obama administration's priorities. And then what does it do to a whole range of people who are looking at China in a different eyes? And if Biden once again changes US policies, that's going to create quite a bit of a rupture, I think, in the region. So I think we're in for some rough days. I agree with Nirupama that we can manage it because we managed on both sides. We know all the people who are likely to be advisors. But I think we got to know the sources of domestic contestation will have an impact. And finally, on the H-1B issue, actually, if it goes back to a merit-based immigration, Indians will continue to do well. But I think we must remember that every Indian engineer can't believe he has a right to work in the United States. This, for 50 years, Indian middle class had a great open borders across the world, in the English-speaking world, in the Anglo-Saxon world, in Singapore, in many other places, in the Gulf. But I think those windows are closing because immigration is a problem. But domestic politics in most countries. And I think we must be prepared for that, rather than merely saying, look, how many visas are going to we get? Because it's not just Trump who's opposed it. New York Times, if you remember 2-3 years ago, ran a series of full-page stories on how the Indian tech companies had gamed the H-1B systems. So I think I would say on immigration, on international policies, and on trade policies, we must be prepared for change, and we must be prepared for unexpected developments in the US policy.
Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. I'd like to ask you one more question since we lost you there in your introductory remarks. Is it fair to say that you have a wait and watch policy with regard to how Biden reacts on China? Because the needle has moved on China, and I think as Ambassador Rao had said earlier, there's fair opposition across the board with regards to the American public view on China. So say I'm thinking about China and Pakistan at the UN, for example. Although Biden will want to cooperate with China on climate change, do you think we're actually going to see some walking back on positions at the UN? That's the first question. And the second question about, you put it quite well in saying every Indian engineer thinks he has a right to work in the United States. Why is India, and historically, why has India been so vested in this H-1B issue? These are all individuals who are eventually going to become citizens of another country. You're going to lose them from your vote bank. And also, we're not talking about millions of people in a country of 1.3 billion people. This is a drop, and no disrespect meant to the very real issues they face. But politically, they're not like a huge vote bank.
No, I would say, I think in the nuance wise, I think what you said broadly is right. But I think on the China policy, the deep state, that is the FBI, the CIA, the defense, they have moved much more hostile to China. In the Congress, the Democrats have moved any number of resolutions in the last few days on challenging China, from Tibet to Xinjiang to a whole range of issues. But the politics, look, when a new president comes, he's going to define priorities. If climate change is the central problem for the world, if that is the formulation of Biden manifesto, and he says, look, I need to get that deal, I'm going to temper the other issues. President has enormous powers in the US. So I think all I'm saying is, look, we have to be prepared for that. I'm saying we can't change it. That is US domestic politics. But if it happens, we should be prepared to deal with it. On the H-1B, there was a time when we called it brain drain. From 2000 or onwards, we now celebrate Indian diaspora abroad. We do all kinds of things with them. So I think the attitudes have changed. But H-1B visas really work for the tech companies in India, where they're moving people from here to there. But in the US, there is a questioning of insourcing of labor, outsourcing of production. Both have become controversial. So there will be some changes. I mean, irrespective of who wins, procurement rules, state governments will pass rules, local employment, all kinds of things will happen. But if it is a merit-based immigration, we'll still be on the top, rather than demanding that, look, somehow we have a special privilege to go to the US because it's Gulf, or people are going to come back now because there's going to be a problem in many countries. Singapore, where there was never an anti-Indian resentment, there is anti-Indian resentment today. If you read the local newspaper, every day there's a problem. So I think there's been a surge of Indian diaspora expansion, and globally, the economic contraction downturn is putting some pressure. And I think we got to recognize that. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's going to be a new situation that our policymakers must be prepared for.
Emma, I'd like to come back to you, and I'll issue the disclaimer again that your organization is non-partisan before I ask you this question. Based on the data that you've given us, there's some weak, from Obama to Hillary Clinton to Biden, there's some evidence, weak evidence, that Democrats are losing, and I say weak because, there's the pre-poll evidence, and then there's the post-poll evidence for 2008, 12, 16, and now it's a pre-poll situation. But there is this evidence that Democrats are losing Indian Americans to the Republicans, although they still maintain a considerable lead. Why do you think this is?
I think you have to look at two interesting things, and I've not found a way to reconcile the data. One is more Indian Americans are becoming registered Democrats over time. At the same time, if you see the numbers, Trump has gained in this election, right? So it kind of doesn't seem to add up. And the only thing I can think of is Trump has invested an enormous amount of capital on wooing Indian Americans by doing the Howdy Modi event, by going to Ahmedabad, by now having a video that he's put out celebrating Indian Americans that's been viewed 10 million times. So he has definitely invested capital in wooing this vote. And so it's this interesting thing where the Indian Americans who have become citizens of the US, who are born in India, I think that's the group that's tilting more in this camp of let's vote for Trump. Whereas the Americans born in the US are pretty much very liberal group, and they are staying with Biden. I think so. These are the things that are happening within the community at this time, is the older voter is being wooed by Trump, and the younger side is firmly in the Democratic camp.
Thank you. Ambassador Rao, you talked about an inevitability in India and the US growing closer and closer, and particularly in the context of what's happening now with China. And I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question not directly, immediately related to the topic, but is there a going back to India-China relations as they were before, say, May and before April and May this year, and before the clashes? And how do you think this fits in with our relationship with the US? Are we going to have an alliance? Are we going to have an alliance with the US in all but name? And what is China's role in this? Do we have China to thank for this, as Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon said at another event recently?
Yeah, I was just saying the other day, if you ask the question, who lost China? I think it's really China that lost China. I mean, the way its whole image has suffered in the region. But before I answer your question, Sriram, I wanted to also flag one important point. I believe it's crucial, since we are looking at internal politics in the United States. You have the congressional elections also taking place in November. And if, as is forecast, largely forecast, that the House of Representatives will go Democrat, and possibly the Senate also will go Democrat, in which case you're going to have quite a broken system, because if Trump wins, that is, it's going, the internal governance issues, domestic policies, I mean, it's going to be quite difficult. How are you going to transact government business if you're going to have this sort of division, internal divisions present themselves? And of course, we really don't know what Mr. Trump is going to do in his second administration, so I'll reserve my judgment on that. Coming to your question on China and India, I don't believe there's any going back to the situation as it was existing before the April-May situation when China began to build up in areas along the line of actual control. And you saw those transgressions and culminating in the events in Galwan on the 15th of June. So that inflection point was definitely touched and crossed, I think, with Galwan. And I don't believe there's going to be any going back. There's been a complete erosion of trust between India and China. The trust issue is so important if you're going to have to build a good relationship. Secondly, I think the structure of relations, the processes of relations that we had built and tried to sustain over the last 3 decades have also frayed and somewhat broken down. So it's a question of how we are to restore equilibrium in this relationship. We're trying to see whether we can have de-escalation, disengagement, but at this moment, everything is so fluid and so uncertain. Why are the Chinese doing it? Why are they so assertive? Why are they so aggressive? Why are they so overzealous about, trying to enforce their territorial claims? That's a question that we can debate endlessly. Now, how can will the US be our, source of strength and support in this situation? I think across the partisan divide in the US, even if within the country everything is so polarized, when it's come to India and the situation we face with China, I think it's been very clear that support has come from both sides and it will be sustained. And in a sense, there is this historical memory that muscle memory, as it were, in US-India relations. When we had the conflict in 1962, the first country that really came to our support in terms of, material, in terms of, equipment, and in terms of, just that moral support was the United States. So there's been a tradition, there's been a precedence of American support for us in such situations. And I'm sure even if we're not asking America to fight our battles for us, obviously that cannot be so. We will have to face the Chinese ourselves along this long border of 3,500 kilometers, the line of actual control, as it were. Sometimes we tend to confuse border and LAC. They're quite different. That's another issue we can talk about separately. So that's where I think the whole Indo-Pacific scenario comes. Even if it's a continental problem that we have with China, because, we are facing China across a Eurasian land space. The border in Ladakh is essentially, part of that construct. But India is naturally endowed in terms of its geographical assets, in terms of its coastline, in terms of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the whole vantage position that we have over the central Indian Ocean. And how are we going to leverage that? And that is where I think our partnerships with countries like the United States, with Japan, with Australia, the Quad as we see it, with the ASEAN, which has often been defined as the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy, as it were. So these are the options and these are the avenues that we should be looking at. And that's where I think the partnership with the United States, the increasing interoperability, the exercises we do, the maritime domain awareness that we try to build, the freedom of navigation that we want, the rule-based international order, the codes of conduct that we want to see, and also, as we move forward, the way we define the Quad. It can have a bilateral focus, it can have a trilateral focus, it can have a plurilateral focus, it can go beyond. I don't know why we just talk about Malabar, the Malabar exercise, to Malabar or not to Malabar. That's not the question, I think, as far as the Quad is concerned. What more can we do within the Quad, whether it's technology, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's cyber, whether it's, more transparent methods of delivering development assistance the way the Chinese have not been able to do. So there's a lot that needs to be done.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador Rao. Dr. Rajamohan, I'd like to ask you a connected question about the visions for the Indo-Pacific, and I'm thinking about Mr. Modi's comments 2 years ago. I believe it was at the Shangri-La dialogue. It was a more inclusive vision, a positive vision, and he was quite clear not to exclude China relative to the US vision. Do you see a convergence in these visions? And can you also touch upon something Ambassador Rao said about what's going to happen with the Quad? There's a sense it's getting more formalized, of course. Where do you see that going?
think I just wanted to step back a bit and respond to your question on alliance. Look, I think, there's so much debate in India whether we are going to be entrapped into an American alliance. Look, an alliance is not an offer. I mean, I haven't seen anything from the American discourse to say we want to offer an alliance to the United States. In fact, Trump is saying America should pull back from alliances. That it is given, why is he defending Germany, the richest country in the world? Why aren't the Japanese paying more? So I don't think anybody in the US is offering us an alliance. So all we're talking about in the Indo-Pacific, if there are shared interests, can we do more things together? So I think the debate on the Quad, I think has tended to get too hyped up in India. And that if there are convergent interests, we will work with other partners. Nobody objects to we sitting in the BRICS with the Chinese and the Russians. Nobody says it's anti-American, but the moment we sit in the Quad, it becomes anti-Chinese. So I think there is a stiltedness to this whole debate about, when it comes to the US. My sense on the Indo-Pacific is, look, the bigger the pressure from us from the Chinese, whether it's in the Himalayas or whether it's in the Indian Ocean, we have, I think, no choice but to step up our partnerships, including Japan, Australia, and consolidating our own natural position in the Indian Ocean. That there are things we do on our own with some countries. There are things you want to do with the US. There are things you want to do with Australia and Japan. So I think it is an imbalance that has emerged in the Indo-Pacific with the rise of China. But I wouldn't take the Shangri-La speech too seriously. Look, that is diplomatic. You pleasing the ASEAN guys. I think in 2 years, a lot has happened in the last 2 years, given what the Chinese are doing, given the pressures on us. So I think the speech was a feel-good speech. Its value was in endorsing the concept. Till then, the system was fighting on the concept of Indo-Pacific. But I think the story has moved quite a bit in the last 2 years. And I think I would say watch out our collaboration bilaterally with the Americans, where much more is happening than on the Quad, and the other mechanisms that are unfolding. So we are in the asymmetric situation with China. That is our fundamental problem. How we square that up, the US and Japan are going to play a big role in it, but with no guarantees of how much the Americans agree to pay. At this point, this administration is eager. Who knows the next? So I would say keep an open mind. We'll navigate, as Nirupama said. Look, we have to navigate whatever changes come from Washington, but we should keep an open mind rather than presupposing a lot of things when Trump is and when Biden comes.
Great. Okay, Emma, I'd like to switch tack a bit over here, and I'd like to go back to the domestic situation in the US. Now, this is something that doesn't get talked about much in India in the context of the diaspora. But how connected, and I'm aware you've done some work on this, how connected is the Indian diaspora to the Black Lives Matter movement and questions of racial justice that do not directly pertain to their own demographic?
Great. There's one other point, Sriram, if you don't mind for me to transgress. I think I want to pick up on a point that was brought up earlier on the H-1B situation. I think we're talking of rules and regulations, but what we're both all forgetting now is the role of the diaspora in all this stuff. There are hundreds of Indian software companies, nothing to do with H-1Bs. These are software product companies who are setting up shop in the US and selling products in the US. And they have a company incorporated in Delaware with a company also incorporated in India. These guys are creating hundreds and thousands of jobs, okay, and being funded by venture capital, global venture capital money, okay? And many of them are unicorn companies now. Some of them from Chennai, like Freshworks and many others, right? So that corridor is not bound by these rules and regulations that are typically viewed as in foreign policy, right? That corridor is extremely strong. Is not dependent on H-1B visas and Indians being wanted in the US. These are entrepreneurs who will go anywhere in the world to make money and to be successful, right? So let's not forget that corridor is super strong and only growing in stature and size and in GDP sense as well. The second one is also don't forget that American companies are investing heavily in the Indian tech scene, right? As evidenced by Facebook and so many others putting almost $20 billion into Reliance Jio. And I think there's probably another 50 to 100 billion waiting in the wings to come into India for various technology projects across the board. So let's not forget the role of the diaspora, regardless of what US and India work on the on the foreign policy side, right? So I just want to bring that
Absolutely
attention, right? That it's going to be a great, strong diaspora to India connect in terms of the technology corridor that's only going to be more and more robust. So just wanted to bring that up. Now, in terms of Black Lives Matter, it's an interesting question you raise, and that is the Indian community and the Black community really didn't understand each other, honestly, till Black Lives Matter happened. You know, we were all people of color, but we were people of different color. We were people, some who were privileged like the Indians, and the Blacks were underprivileged. So there was not a good understanding between the two. But when BLM happened, you know, there was an outpouring of support from the Indian American community. You know, people called in diaspora and said, what are we doing to stand up for other people of color? And this was a very interesting new kind of model that's forming, alliance that's forming, if you will, between people of color. You know, even if you look at Kamala Harris, she is 50% Black, 50% Indian, but in general, she's a woman of color. So I think that understanding is coming across our whole diaspora to where we are actively and vocally supporting move against racial injustice. In fact, in diaspora had a town hall, and we had a pastor, very interesting Black gentleman who has his own church, but he's married to an Indian lady. So again, all these new alliances are being formed where there's better understanding that we are all people of color, and people of color can be discriminated. They may not know you might be Indian or Black or Latino. You know, there's going to be this inherent prejudice. So there's a huge support of BLM, and there's a greater understanding. In fact, in diaspora members are looking at funding Black startups. In diaspora members are talking to Black colleges to see if we can hire more Blacks into the technology industry. So changes are being made, and this is a new phenomenon that we're experiencing at this point.
Thanks, Amar. I don't want to hog all the time with my own questions, so I think we're going to have to go to the audience for some questions now. I can see some in the Q&A box. A special request, whoever's typing questions, to please keep it to the point, because I actually have to read the whole thing before I get to the point. Let's start with this question for whoever wants to take it. This was sent ahead of time. Will the new US presidency ensure India's admission as a permanent veto-carrying member of the UN Security Council? Maybe Ambassador Rao and then Dr. Raja Mohan.
I know that this is a question that fires up all of us Indians. This is an aspirational goal that we all would like to see fulfilled. And everybody is aware that during the Obama administration, during President Obama's visit to India in the winter of 2010, he made a speech where, you know, he expressed support in principle for India's entry as a permanent member of the Security Council, in a reformed Security Council. But as we all know, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. You know, that support has been re-expressed by the Trump administration also. So, but that support by itself is not going to get us into permanent membership of the UN Security Council. It will require support within the General Assembly. That should not be a great problem, but it will require support from all the veto exercising members of the Security Council, all the permanent 5. And we all know where, you know, China, for instance, stands on this issue, despite the fact that if China knew its history well, it would understand the extent of Indian support for its own case to become a permanent member of the Security Council in the 1950s. But never mind, whatever history may teach. But the fact is that, yes, I expect that in future, even a Biden administration will reinforce that support, in words at least. But when it comes to deed, I think this is where the complications arise. The whole structure within the United Nations and the Security Council, that post-1945 world order, which we would like to see reformed, is not easily transformed because of these underlying complications and complexities.
I might just follow Nirupama on that. I mean,
yeah.
it's a check you can't cash. No bank is going to cash a verbal expression of support because Chinese are opposed to it, and there's nothing to hint Chinese are going to let us in, welcome us into the P5, the veto-wielding membership. But I think the real interesting stuff is not in the UN Security Council. It is the alternative institutions that are beginning to emerge, where I think there will be a lot of action. I think that's where we need to be focused. This is a dead duck. It's not ever going to walk. For example, Trump has invited us for a G10 or a G11. We don't know if the Russians will come in or not. So that's a new coalition that's being pitched as a new coalition that's going to deal with the world. China is not in it. That is one idea that's come from the Trump side. Hopefully it will take place after the election. The second, the Biden's platform talks about a democracy summit. That one of the first things he's going to do after the election is to convene a democracy summit. So presumably India will be invited. So I think, so these two, one set of ideas of that, look, the democracies of the world must get together to deal with the new challenge that has emerged to the rules-based order. That is one new development. I think there are a lot of possibilities there. Second, I think more on the semi-economic stuff, that this idea that we need to reduce our economic dependence on the supply chain centered around China. And we need a new set of arrangements, whether it's in the medical side, whether it is in the electronic side, this idea, the resilient supply chains. The Americans are talking about the Quad Plus, for example, is far more interesting there. What it has negotiated, it started some talks on how do we create new coalitions to build supply chains. Last week, we had India, Japan, Australia talk about it. A whole lot of all on the non-Chinese side, an attempt at reconstituting the global supply chains. That I think is going to be far more consequential for us than the diplomacy about getting through the Security Council, voted in as the newest member. So this change and where we don't talk about democracies, Britain, for example, is talking about on 5G, can democracy from a D10, can it get together? So where we are is really like-minded countries as opposed to democracies. Can there be a coalition of like-minded countries that will try and change the rules of the international system or defend against the Chinese subversion of the international system? That is the new debate. And I think the UNSC will have the least important role in it. So I think this is the new debate. I think we need to deal with it. It will be quite exciting.
Okay, I want to ask a question to whoever wants to answer it. And MR, I'm hoping you can also come in on this since you have industry perspective. This is about supply chains, and from what I was hearing in Washington last year before the China's excessive adventurism began, the recent episodes, when the tariff wars were starting, companies were pulling out of China and there was talk of moving to India as one of the alternatives. But my sense was that that wasn't the best option. India lost an opportunity to some extent, not completely, to Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. So now we've got another opportunity here to become I think the phrase used is trusted and reliable. Maybe the trust part is there, but the reliability. What needs to happen so that India can maximize this opportunity of becoming a valuable part of global supply chains now that this opportunity has come knocking again at its door?
Great question, Sriram. And I think here's where the diaspora can play a role. There are so many Indian Americans, for example, in the electronic supply chain. They work at companies like Intel and NVIDIA and Apple and Google and so many of these companies where they could play a role in creating, for example, an electronic supply chain that could come to India and be based in India as a second source. I think the way to go into this is not saying replace the Chinese supply chain, but be a second source, just in case things like COVID or tariffs happen. There's at least two sources for supply chain. So I can immediately see aerospace, electronics, and some of these industries where the diaspora can play a role. And this is where I think the Indian government needs to really have a good partnership with leaders in the diaspora to actually look at specific vertical industry supply chains, bring together a group of advisors who are Indian American from those industries to really shape some new supply chains. I think this can happen again, despite trade wars or any of these other things, right? These are things where the diaspora can meaningfully help in setting up these supply chains. The other thing is there are more and more CEOs. In Diaspora, in fact, published a business leaders list a couple of months ago, where we highlighted there were 60 CEOs of Indian origin in the Fortune 500 and Forbes 2000, right? These are eminent, successful Indian American business leaders primarily. So again, reach out to people of Indian origin who are running large companies in consumer goods and financial services and many, many other industries, biotech and so forth, to really have the diaspora help bring some meaningful supply chains to India. So I think this is an area ripe for opportunity, regardless of which administration comes into power.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think I would say the policy is really, the challenge is domestically, if you can make ease of business. I mean, I think why countries go to Vietnam is because India is still not a hospitable environment. Here, I think if we succeed in demonstrating that Apple and Foxconn, the Taiwanese have been very eager to move here. If we demonstrate one sector, for example, government claims there's some success in the smartphone sector, where large number of companies that were earlier working in China moving to India, some of them to Chennai. If that actually demonstrably succeeds, then I think the model of production-linked incentive scheme can be replicated in other areas, in pharmaceuticals, in other sectors. So it's what we do at home matters a lot more, I think. But their interest, as you said, trusted and reliable. Others want to have options. The question is, can we do enough domestically to become an option?
Ambassador?
Yeah, yes. I think supply chain resilience is extremely important, and I think we've taken some initial steps with Japan and Australia to discuss this. But even more importantly, this inflection point that we have come to in our relationship with China really creates a lot of complexities for us when it comes to the economic and trade sector. Because just take the issue of active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into, our pharmaceutical industry. Somebody was saying the other day that 100% of the APIs that we use in the manufacture of paracetamol in India come from China. Now, how and why should that situation have come about? These are points and issues that need to be addressed without any further delay. Similarly, on electronics, much of the supply chain we are dependent on comes from China, and that doesn't make our situation any better. So even as we try to decouple this whole antagonistic decoupling, as it were, that is taking place vis-a-vis China, how are we going to put in place the reforms? We often talk of reform and opening up. Leave the opening up for the moment with all the self-reliance and Atmanirbharta that we want. But what are the reforms that we need to introduce within the country to make it more conducive for us to revive the manufacturing strengths that we lost over the last 30 years as we developed trade with China? And the other aspect that we need to look at is high-end manufacturing. We obviously don't want to start manufacturing more and more cheaper goods, although yes, our domestic market needs it, and I'm not saying we should discount the importance of it, but high-end manufacturing, that's where, frontier technologies come in, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, data analytics. And as MR said, the Indian diaspora in the United States, it's a wealth of talent that exists there, know-how and capacity and capital that India could use at this moment. And we need to also tap into people like, just to cite one instance, Dr. Arogya Swami Paul Raj. He's a professor emeritus at Stanford University. He has extensive knowledge of the technology sector in China. He's dealt a lot with China over the years. I think we need to create a brains trust of such people who can come to our assistance and support at this time and provide that valuable input of ideas and new concepts that we need in a situation that is essentially undefined for us at the moment.
Okay, I want to go to an audience question here, which I will summarize. Basically, it says, and I'm hoping that all three of you can answer it very quickly. Do you have any concerns that a potential Biden administration will pursue a more interventionist foreign policy with respect to India in order to basically because of the pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who are skeptical of Biden? And since I said I would promise to put everyone on the spot a bit, I'm going to insert my own question here. How did we get to this point where it's pro-India or human rights? Are we at that point? That second part is my question.
So I would say, maybe if I want to jump in, I mean,
Sure.
look, of course, the progressive wing would want to intervene. They want to fight corruption across the world. That's Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren want to do it. The trade wing wants human rights conditions attached to trade, environmental conditions attached to trade. They would push that. The human rights groups will say, look, let's focus on India, what's happening in Kashmir, what's happening in various places, CIC, all that stuff will come. But my sense is, look, this is par for the course. I mean, I think India has dealt with these kind of issues. If you go back to the early 90s when Nirupama was there, I mean, I was with the Hindu that time in Washington. There were routine anti-India resolutions on Khalistan and by Kashmir. Ghulam Nabi Fai is still around, I believe, Sriram. I don't know if you run into him. Yeah. So there used to be routinely passed in the US Congress. But I think with the systematic action by our embassy, by our diaspora, by our business groups, in American groups interested in India, within 2 years, it was defeated comprehensively. They couldn't even move a resolution. So I think we should not be rattled by some groups are going to raise issues on human rights. But I think US is eventually transactional. It's not a curse of Trump administration. Our skill lies in navigating this, of trading off one thing to another. But I think we should be prepared for that. We've taken a lot of things for granted because things were good on a lot of fronts. But some of those problems will come back. But I think we've dealt with them before. Compared to what we were dealing with before, this is really relatively minor. But I would focus more on the economic side. That's where the challenge is going to be, on the trade side, on the environmental side. The interventionist agenda is going to be far more severe this time because the scale of issues involved. Because Biden has openly said, look, he will not sign a new trade agreement unless the environmentalists and the labor groups approve it. So I think there is a new reality there. We have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think, Sriram, the reality here on the ground I see is if there's a new administration, a Biden administration, they have enough fires to fight, right? So I don't think they're even going to get to this for a long time, right? And there was supposed to be a trade deal even done in the past 2 years, which still never got done, right? So I think it's going to be punted into the future. I don't think there'll be any immediate. I think if Biden comes in, he'll have so much work to do to, first of all, unite the country and do all kinds of things. I think it'll be a while. The second thing is there are many people who might come in with Biden who have been old India hands, as Nirupama knows. So they can go back again in history and do things as well. So I won't be overly concerned if that happens. If Trump comes back, of course, there'll be all kinds of renewed issues and challenges that we have to face as well. So I think, it's like Raja Mohan said, we're used to this. India is used to this.
Okay, Ambassador.
I would agree with both Raja and with MR, and I think we have the skills, the inbuilt capacity to navigate such a situation, assuming that if a Biden administration comes to power and there is an emphasis on human rights and internal Indian issues when it comes to the progressive wing or so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I think we have the capacity to navigate this. And as far as the White House is concerned, as far as an administration, a Biden administration is concerned, I think they will be propelled and they will be guided by the basic values and the strategic interests in this relationship, whether it is in concerning the situation in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's dealing with the strategic challenge vis-a-vis China. So that three-body problem will figure again. I don't believe this will just be a strict binary, human rights or bust. It won't be that.
So another related question for whoever wants to answer it. Ami Bera, who is now heading the same body that was headed by Brad Sherman that had this hearing on Kashmir last year that really rankled a lot of people. He said last December, and I was there when he said it, that, if India wants a seat at the big table, it should start, it needs to worry less about being criticized. Of course, it's going to get criticized. The US gets criticized by everyone and anyone. And if you want a seat at the top table, that's going to happen. Anyone care to comment on that? Do you think we need to grow a thicker skin in India, or rather, deal with criticisms and see what we can change?
I think you don't need a thicker skin. See, look, I think it is the US system is a divided government. There will be a hearing. Some other chairman would want to hear something. Somebody dealing with labor issues would want to hear something. So a lot of that will happen continuously. And I think some of that we must take as routine. As long as Nirupama said, look, there are bigger interests that we can keep the focus on them, while we have to fight these battles at the lower level, at the operational level, reaching out to the right people. So that is a tactical operation. But the strategic consensus, what we've seen in the last 20 years, the strategic convergence has helped put down a lot of these fires. I think if the progressive wing is more powerful, there will be a lot of that noise. But I think we'll need to work even harder to douse those fires that are likely to come.
Ambassador Rao, I think there's a question which is probably directed to you here. It's a second order question as far as our topic today is concerned, but it has impacts on what we're discussing. China's recent aggressions in Galwan come at the same time as increasing hostilities with Taiwan and with other countries in the South China Sea. The fact that China seems to be comfortable opening up multiple potential areas of conflict internationally, could that point to shaky internal dynamics within China's leadership? Is that a way for them to deflect from what's going on locally?
Yeah, I'd like to, in fact, recall what a very veteran diplomat from Singapore said recently, Bilahari Kausikan. He said that there's a single point of failure in the Chinese system, and that single point of failure, potential failure, is Xi Jinping. So he controls everything, he presides over the country, but if things were to go wrong, I mean, only he has to answer for them. This whole policy, this excessive centralization, this aggressive nationalism that you see, this overzealous, hyper-nationalism to the region, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's policy towards Hong Kong, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's on the land border with India. I think it all goes back to Xi Jinping, really, because that is the mantra that he is sought to inculcate down the line on all that he controls within the Chinese system.
Okay, very quickly, in conclusion, MR, my question for you is, what is the next role at the people-to-people level? How do you see, as the generations progress in America, obviously the connection with India becomes more tenuous. What is the next stage for the diaspora in India-US relations and supporting that relationship?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, Sriram. One is, we talk to our friends in the Israeli citizens and Jewish Americans as well to find out how they have evolved over time. And one of the programs that they have is called Birthright Israel. And in Diaspora has started a program similar to that called Heritage India, where Indian American children who have not been to India have the opportunity when they're 18 years old to apply to us. And we, in fact, took a batch of them this past year to India to expose them to history, culture, civilization, and so forth, to really form that connect for the next generation of Indian American children to really, get to know India and so forth. And thanks to, our friend Chris Gopalakrishnan, he was kind enough to underwrite that effort. So we plan those kinds of programs. I think the other one is on the philanthropy side. I think there's a lot of interest in the US amongst even the next generation to do work in India, to apply for a Fulbright or to come to India to work for an NGO and to have internships in India. So again, these are things that we're examining over time. And in fact, Diaspora has a philanthropy summit coming up October 1st to coincide closely with Gandhi Jayanti as well, to kind of connect the Indian diaspora here with philanthropy in India and so forth. So I think we have a lot of different connects planned, but they have to be systematic and done over time. So we look forward to, building more of these bridges as time happens.
That's very interesting, MR. And Ambassador Rao and Dr. Raja Mohan, for you, my concluding question is, President Obama said in his first term that the US-India partnership can be one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. Do you believe it will be the defining partnership, Ambassador Rao?
I believe for India, it is already a very defining partnership. And I recall what Mr. Biden said in 2006, that by 2020, he expected this to be the most important foreign policy relationship for our century. So maybe we're not there as yet, but certainly the aspiration exists on both sides to achieve that level of mutual trust and confidence and deeper friendship in this relationship. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan.
I think it all depends on us. I think the more we do well economically, the more we are coherent at home. Our relative weight in the international system has consistently grown, and that's the reason why we have so many good relationships, especially with the United States. So I think the stronger we are at home, the better we are on the economic front. The huge amount of opportunities to expand this relationship. I think the much more is to come than we have actually seen. So, but that doesn't have to be, we don't have to be the number one for the US. If we keep improving and expanding the relationship, that is great enough.
Can I just add one thing here?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
I just recall those words of Robert Browning: a man's reach must exceed his grasp. And I think that should be our approach when it comes to the India-US relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador Rao, Dr. Rajamohan, and Mr. M.R. Rangaswamy. This has been a very interesting and enlightening discussion for the past 1.5 hours. We didn't initially intend for it to go on that long, but there's just so much to get through. And it's a topic that I think people are very interested in and will be interested in for the foreseeable future. I also want to thank Vanita Shankar and Venu and Gopal and everybody else at the CIC for giving me this opportunity to moderate this and to discuss these issues with you. And I'll hand it back to you, Vanita.
Yes, brilliant. Thanks, Sriram. Thanks for putting this together for us, and thanks to all the panelists for joining this evening and making it a great session. It was lovely working with you all, and thanks to our attendees who've joined us this evening, and we hope to see you all back again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sriram, and thank you to our panelists today. Thank you so much, Sriram. It was brilliant.
Thank you so
You did
much.
a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.